I would like to introduce two guests that are with me here tonight that are going to talk about the USS Evans and how it went down during the Vietnam War with a loss of 74 sailors, and yet the names of those sailors are not on the wall here on the mall. My first guest is Bill Thibeault from Norwich, Connecticut. Welcome, Bill. Good to have you on the show. And my second guest is Chris Dewey, who's from Newport Richey, Florida. Welcome, Chris, to the show. Let me just refer to this graphic, if I could, over here that shows the aircraft carrier Melbourne hitting the USS Frank Evans amidships, slicing it in half. Within 3 minutes, the bow section went down. 74 hands were lost on board. Bill, you were asleep in the after section of the Evans. Tell me what happened that night.
Well, like I said, before I was up on the top bunk when we got hit, and all of a sudden I just heard this loud screeching, grinding metal noise. And next thing you know, I was on the deck. Emergency lights came on, and everything was just strewn all over the compartment, and people were just stunned and just wondering what happened. We had no clue at the time, so we went up onto the stern, and I noticed helicopters flying all over the place with searchlights, and we just still didn't know what was going on at the time. I didn't know what happened until we had climbed up onto the superstructure in the back, and I looked forward and saw that the front half of the ship was missing.
What were your feelings at that point?
At that point, I was confused, totally confused. I didn't know what was going on, a little shaken up. Didn't find out what actually happened until we got on the Melbourne.
And the Melbourne was the large Australian aircraft carrier that had actually sliced through the USS Evans. And this took place in the South China Sea during the Vietnam War. Chris, you were also aboard the Evans. You were in the bow section. The bow section went down so quickly. What happened? How did you experience this terrible disaster?
Well, my experience started very much like Bill's did, with that horrendous screeching noise and with the whole front end going over on its starboard side, the right side. And at that point, I had no idea what was going on any more than Bill did. That noise, the only thing I could think of was they were dropping anchor, and that made no sense at all. In which case, everything went on to automatic at that point in time. All of a sudden, the ceiling was the wall. The place just turned into a maze with hanging bunks, and the battle lights were on, as Bill said it was in the rear. And at that point, it was just trying to find some orientation and start to find some way out. And being several decks down from the main deck where the 1st Division compartment was, first it was to get out of there, and then went by the forward officers' quarters, the junior officers' quarters, where nobody made it out. The ladder there had stuck in front of the door. Got to the mess decks and all of these tables which are bolted right to the floor. Then you had to cross this 30 or 40 foot area, jumping from table base to table base in order to get across. People didn't make it, were falling down. They were starting to fill up with water at the bottom of this, very little light. Crawling over across this entire area over to the only way out to the main deck, and there was one hatch on the port side right there, and no one would have got out of there alive except for the efforts of the boatswain mate of the watch, Petty, who had escaped from the bridge by swimming down underneath the submerged superstructure, swimming around the bow, climbing back up on board the ship, and unjamming that hatch so that virtually everyone who did survive from the forward section left through there.
So if it wasn't for him, Chris, you probably wouldn't be here today.
No probably about it at all.
No probably about it.
In fact, the guy right behind me had to swim to the surface. So we're talking about a few seconds difference would have been.
And the bow section went down with 74 hands on board, lost in an area off the coast of Vietnam. The Evans had been involved previously in combat support operations in Vietnam, was probably going to go back to Vietnam, but because of the location of the Evans during this accident, this incident, those 74 men who went down with the bow section, their names are not on the wall. Let's turn to that for a moment. There's a short film clip that I would like to show that deals with that issue, because in the past, members of Congress have attempted to rectify that situation. Let's take a short moment to watch this 3-minute film.
How could it happen for a U.S. destroyer to survive combat and end up like this? And how could we forget the 74 men who were lost that day? Richard La Liberté can't forget. The ship was the USS Frank E. Evans. On board, his father, Chief Petty Officer George Joseph La Liberté.
Vietnam was not a popular war, but they were out there doing what they were supposed to do, and, you know, they did it.
The night of June 3rd, 1969, the Evans was taking part in maneuvers in the South China Sea. An Australian aircraft carrier slammed directly into the Evans, cutting the smaller ship in two. While the stern stayed afloat, the bow and the men below deck never had a chance. On a website dedicated to the story of the Evans and its crew, one of the survivors, Vern Cash, recalled that night.
It was like being in the middle of a train wreck. The ship rolled violently to starboard, but it didn't stop at just 10 or 20 degrees. It kept on going. I thought it would never stop. Then with a loud boom, there was silence.
The ship sank fairly quickly, basically 3 minutes. You know, the ship was literally cut in two, and it filled with water and sank.
Another survivor, Pete Peters, was trapped below deck. His words are also recounted on the website.
I was praying and crying also because I was very scared. The water kept rising. It was up to my chin. My face was between two large steam pipes, and I couldn't go any higher. In my mind, I saw the faces of my mother and father, and I saw the face of my girlfriend, Karen. I just knew I was going to die.
Pete Peters made it out. Vern Cash made it out. George La Liberté made it out, then went back to help a friend.
The story I heard was that a friend of his was having trouble getting through the mess hall, so he went back to help him out, and that was the last they seen of him.
There were 58,148 casualties in the Vietnam War. Their names are inscribed on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, known simply as the Wall. In a quiet spot on the Washington Mall, you'll find the names of those killed between 1959 and 1975. You will not find the names of the 74 crewmen of the Frank E. Evans. The crew of the Evans was left off because of where the accident happened. Even though the ship was on maneuvers, it was just outside the combat zone. And being inside that line is one of the criteria for inclusion on the wall.
I'm prior military too, so I understand that. You know, it has an honor because of the criteria they set. So I understand that, but even if they don't qualify to be on the wall, they should be honored somehow.
Bill, we've seen the clip. Obviously, this brings back memories. Let me ask you this. 74 of your buddies died on the Evans that terrible night. Should they be on the wall?
By all means. They wouldn't have died if it wasn't for the Vietnam War. They would not have died. We would not have been out on maneuvers with the Australians and the other countries that we were out on maneuvers with. This was a training exercise to bring all of the navies together to accomplish our missions, and that was to win the war in Vietnam.
Chris, what are your feelings about that?
Oh, I feel the same way Bill does, that, but there's a few additional things that these bodies will never be recovered. Mm-hmm. They don't have a place, they don't have a gravestone over the body. Their names, they need to be on the wall. And actually, I thought that the creator of the wall's words on this subject are really just to the point. And I found this the other day, Ms. Lynn, that she says, you touch a name and the pain is released. And that's what's really needed for all the parents, mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and cousins like Mr. La Liberté, that they need some place to go to touch the past. And in that way, they can relieve their pain. This has been buried, even amongst the survivors, that this has been buried for years and years and years. And even though I can go over a list of these names today, I haven't got the faces anymore. It's been buried so deep for so long that the pain is still there and it just needs to be released.
So this gives these families and the shipmates an opportunity to come to closure with that incident, with that tragic event, just as other families of Vietnam veterans have come to closure at the wall.
Exactly.
Let me ask both of you this. I have a chart or a map here of the country of Vietnam, South Vietnam as we knew it at the time. I was stationed outside of Saigon here, then I was down in the Delta for a while, then I was up in Phu Yen for 2 years. This is the country. This line here shows the area marked as part of the war zone from the standpoint of naval operations. The USS Frank E had been involved in naval gunfire operations up here in the north, then went out of the zone, did some rehab work in the Philippines, then returned down here into this area here where it was struck by the Melbourne and sunk. It's my understanding that it may have been going back into the zone for additional combat support operations. What difference does it really make from your perspective that it was hit here, or let's say hit here?
None whatsoever, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, we were like 95 to 100 miles outside of the combat zone when it happened. I mean, who determines where that line? Who determined where that line actually is? What if the line was out over here and went over here? They would have automatically qualified.
Mm-hmm. So if the maneuvers had occurred, let's say right here, almost as far off of the coast, or over here, which is even further away from Vietnam, this distance here is longer than this distance here, then they would have qualified for the wall.
There would have been no debate.
There would have been no debate.
Qualified automatically.
But as it turned out, they happened to be down here, and so they're not on the wall. Chris, what do you think about that?
Well, we're talking about a technicality here, and I would hate to see people not remembered for the sacrifice they made for this country because of a technicality. I was doing a little research not long ago, and at one point the technicality for the inclusion on the wall was 1961. And there was a father and son combination, the only father and son combination to have died in Vietnam. The son died in 68 or 69. The father died in 1956. Mm-hmm. He didn't qualify for the wall. Mm-hmm. The Air Force reviewed that case, and they changed the qualifications to be 1955. So now, and we had a very similar situation. Not everyone knows of it, but we had the three Sage brothers, which is like the Sullivan brothers in World War II. We had three brothers on board our ship by their own request, and they all died in the accident.
Let me just refer to that. I've got a newspaper article here that has the three Sage brothers. They knew they were taking a risk. At the same time, the family said they thought it would be safer to be at sea on a ship than maybe if they were on land in the Army. And what a terrible tragedy. All three brothers were at the front end, the bow end of the Frank Evans. They all went down together, leaving only one brother still alive. So these are the family tragedies. These are the impact of this terrible incident on the families, and yet none of the three names of those brothers are on the wall. None of the three names are on the wall. Let me make reference to the public law 96-297 that established the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. And it says here that the Memorial Fund determined that the most fitting tribute to those who served in the Vietnam War would be to permanently inscribe the names of the members of the armed forces who died during the Vietnam War. These sailors were members of the armed services. They died during the war. They had been engaged in combat operations just a few weeks before. They were headed back for combat operations a few weeks after doing this training exercise. Why shouldn't this be a no-brainer?
It's a no-brainer to me. There is a ship association for all of the survivors, the Frank E. Evans Association. I first found this online, thank God for the internet. Mm-hmm. And when I first found out about it, they were having a rededication of a memorial to the Sage brothers in Niobrara, Nebraska. And the only one that went to this was the survivors. And I had a chance to talk to these people there. And the wonderful thing about it was that we met the mother of the Sage brothers there. And in a sense, this was the most wonderful thing that could happen for this woman. She had lost 3 sons. She was just a broken person. And all of a sudden, with all the survivors there, that it made such a difference in her life that the entire town took us in. We couldn't buy a beer in this town. And this is a town of a few hundred people. Yeah. And they rededicated this memorial. I'd like to think that the government of the United States, that the military, that they can do as well as several hundred citizens can for their favorite sons as well.
Well, I agree with you, Chris, and I agree with you, Bill. And that's why I have introduced legislation that instructs the Secretary of Defense to review this case and to review any other case that might be like this. We understand that there were some combat aircraft that landed in Thailand after doing a combat mission and crashed and people were killed. Well, you know, maybe it's outside some red line, but those men and perhaps women died in the course of the Vietnam War. They're members of the armed services. Their deaths were a direct result of combat activities, and their families should be extended the same courtesy and the same respect as others who died during that conflict. And this legislation will be referred to the Veterans Affairs Committee as well as the Armed Services Committee. Earlier this evening on the show, we had the chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee. I think we got his commitment to support the legislation. And I think what we need to do is get the Defense Department to look at this case and other cases like it and make recommendations for inclusion. How would you feel about that, Bill, if we come to that point?
Oh, I'd be extremely happy. This is what we've been fighting for the past couple of years. I know Senator Horn out of Long Beach first introduced the bill 2 years ago, which I guess it didn't pass.
Right.
Had 65 House members sign on to the bill, which I believe wasn't enough. But I would love to see that happen this time around. I would be ecstatic. I mean, this is what we're doing this for.
And Bill, you've traveled to Washington, D.C. to help me participate in this show and to promote this idea. If we schedule a public hearing for this legislation, would you be prepared to come back, or maybe bring some of your buddies to come back and testify in favor of this legislation?
I'm prepared to do whatever it takes.
Thank you very much. How about you, Chris? You drove all the way up from Florida. That's a long drive. Would you be willing to come back to testify on this issue?
Certainly. All I had to do was hear from one of my shipmates that my help was needed, and I was here. I dropped everything. I'll drop it again, and I know that every other survivor will do the same exact thing. All they need is an opportunity to tell the story, and I don't think that there's much doubt that once the story is heard and understood, that the Congress will do the right thing.
Well, I agree with you, and I thank you for that. All three of us are Vietnam veterans. All three of us served in the military during that conflict. One of the most difficult things for us to do is actually to go back in our mind to some of those events and some of those days. But if there's an inequity that grows out of that war, if there's an inequity that grows out of our service, I think all of us feel an obligation to our buddies, to our shipmates, in my case to my Army buddies, that we correct that. And we will not rest until it's done, or at least that's the feeling I have. So I want to thank you, both of you, first of all, for your service to the country during that unpopular war. I want to thank God that you both survived that terrible incident. Thank you for coming on the show tonight to share this information with us. And as all of us Vietnam veterans say, welcome home, welcome home.
Thank you very much.
Welcome home. Thank you, God bless you, and good night.